All right. Make sure you're hydrating. Drinking a lot of water, everybody. Very, very important. All right, so our next guest speaker, Jim Myers. Sasquatch. This is a very, very interesting subject. I've been interested in Bigfoot all my life, so Jim and I have a lot of similarities here. Jim Myers is a speaker, museum curator, and avid Sasquatch researcher who is based in the little town of Bailey, Colorado. Jim spent 28 years living and working internationally in the nonprofit world before he and his family moved to Colorado in 2009. Jim's interest in Sasquatch goes all the way back to 1972 when he first saw the film The Legend of Bogey Creek. While the film scared Jim as a young child, it also created an interest in him that would come to fruition many years later. Wow, that movie really scared me too. My brother and I loved that movie. Fast forward to 2013, Jim and his wife, Daphne, had attempted in vain to revive the historic Bailey Country Store. At that same time, Jim met a local woman who had an encounter with a Sasquatch just 2 miles from the store, followed a month later by a visit from the crew of the show, Finding Bigfoot. Jim is a pragmatist, and he decided to take a huge risk. Given the huge number of Sasquatch sightings in central Colorado, the Myers decided to abandon the country store and reopen as the Sasquatch Outpost, housing both a fun gift store, like Paula mentioned, and an educational space called the Sasquatch Encounter Discovery Museum. Stacy in the back took me there a couple months ago, and it is an incredible place. So if you're ever in Bailey, Colorado, you've got to go by the Discovery Museum. Today, the Sasquatch Outpost receives thousands of visitors annually from across the country and the world, and the Sasquatch Encounter Museum has seen some 55,000 visitors since 2016. Jim has been a guest on Coast to Coast Radio, Beyond Belief with George Norrie, and has appeared in numerous documentaries, including the History Channel show Ancient Monster Quest. Let's give a round of applause, please, for Jim Myers. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Break a leg.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Paula publicly for allowing me to be part of this weekend. She's entitled this UFOs, All of the Above and Beyond, and you're going to get some of the beyond this morning. So I've entitled this Down the Rabbit Hole, and I've heard other things referred to as rabbit holes this weekend. And Sasquatch research is certainly one of those because, as you'll see in a moment, how do you research something that science doesn't even acknowledge exists? My clicker is not working, so I'm going to have to go with, I think, the old... Oh, maybe it is now. Maybe not. Let me just start with a moment about Sasquatch research and Sasquatch researchers. These terms are used in a broad sense to describe anyone who wants to hang a plaque outside their door, I am a Sasquatch researcher. Of course, the question is, whoops, sorry about this. That's what happens when you don't have a clicker that works. What title do you give someone who researches a creature that doesn't exist? Is it really a researcher? Are you a researcher? Are you an investigator? I'm not really sure what title to give. Now, there's some value in reading books and others' research and listening to eyewitness accounts, but there's no way to separate the term researcher from time actually spent in the woods and much of the time in the dark. That's when Sasquatch likes to come out. As humans, we fear what we do not understand and we cannot see. It is here among the dark trees that Sasquatch reigns as the apex predator, possessing every possible advantage over weak, fearful, and vulnerable humans. But it's this very vulnerability that makes encounters probable and possible. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. We have to overcome our natural fears and venture into the kingdom of the forest people if we want to understand them. And I use that term forest people very intentionally, because I believe Sasquatch are not animals, but a different type of people from us. So buckle up and join me as we dive down the rabbit hole. Whoops. There's a cartoon here, but you can't see it. It's off to the side. It was two Sasquatch standing there taking a selfie, and one of them says, "Make sure you put the grainy setting in." Explains why Sasquatch is always blurry. So I'm going to tell you a story about a trip I took back in April to an area called the Lost Creek Wilderness of Colorado. It's not too far from where I live. And a particular trail called the Goose Creek Trail. Now, let's see if I can get this to work here. So the trail follows this creek, Goose Creek, and we backpacked into about this location, very steep hill on one side, and camped. And that was myself and a good researcher friend of mine named Jason, who had his two dogs with him. We set up our camp and had some very interesting things happen that night. So what I'm going to do is show you a video that I took the next morning and then go back to a video I took during the night. Let's hope this will work. So we're up, got the fire going. It's about 7:30, 7:45. And we both heard something. Here's our campsite. We both heard something cross the creek. Bipedal. Harley over there was growling. Don't know what it was. I got my thermal out, but it didn't look outside the tent. It didn't want to see beyond the tent walls.
They definitely were here this morning or last night. They ran across there. Without a doubt, I know that's what I heard.
Yeah, me
and
too.
They also threw a rock in the creek.
Did you hear that? Hey, that's my apple. What you doing? So we got up. We had both heard about 3 a.m. We were both awake. I don't sleep a lot when I'm doing this for obvious reasons. And we were both awake. I didn't know he was awake. And I definitely heard something walk across the creek on two legs. It's a very different sound to, say, a bear or a deer walking across a creek to a bipedal creature or person. So I heard something come across the creek. Obviously, that sparked my attention. I kind of perked my ears up. And then I had strung some lights in a little tree about 30 feet away, just little battery-operated lights, and turned them on before I went to bed just to see what would happen. All of a sudden, those lights turned off, and I thought, that's strange. I thought the batteries would last longer on those lights. And then I began to hear some noises outside my tent, and his two dogs started growling. And he told me in the morning that they were both looking at my tent from inside his tent while they were growling. So I took I have a little thermal, at the time I had a little thermal attachment that fits on my iPhone, turned it on, pitch black. The only light in this video was from the thermal as I just kind of scanned the inside of my tent to see what I could film. So let's see if we can get this. Let's see if you can pick up what I missed the first few times that I watched this. So I'm just lying there. I'm just kind of looking around the inside of the tent. You can hear the stream in the background. Now right about, let's see, do you see that shadow? That is a hand on the outside of the tent, rubbing the tent to see what it encounters on the inside. Now, it's the second time I've had that happen where they are kind of investigating to see if they encounter any resistance. And I think they're actually looking for whoever's in the tent to push back, which I've not had the guts to do yet. I'm always thinking, what if I push back and it grabs my hand? And I really believe that what they would do is just pull their hand back, because I honestly don't think they mean me any harm. They're just messing with us and investigating what's inside the tent. So we both heard this. I then backpacked out. Let's see. I stayed another night. Nothing happened that we were aware of. The third morning, I backpacked out. I had to get back to my store, and some other guys came in to join Jason. That night, as is always the case, of course, once I leave, they had something come across the stream again. They heard it walking around the tents, and one of the guys that had just arrived was sleeping in the open in a sleeping bag with just a rain fly over his head. And he woke up, and probably from here to the end of the stage would be the river. There were 2 trees right next to where he was sleeping. There was something over here walking back and forth, pacing back and forth, that he could see. And in the morning, when they got up, there were definite, very large barefoot tracks going back and forth. So that is not uncommon, actually. Having something come into the camp to investigate what we're doing is not that uncommon. So here's a question. Just raise your hand if you think Sasquatch could exist. You guys are nuts. Don't you know this is a cryptozoological creature? But it seems like the majority of you do, and which actually I would have expected in this audience. I always have a percentage of skeptics in the audience, but so here's some of the goals I want in the next few minutes to accomplish. I want to demonstrate that Sasquatch are real, highly intelligent, rational people, not animals, and they're not so terribly different from you and me, as you might think. I'd like to show you that Sasquatch people possess and use abilities that we can only define as superhuman or paranormal, powers that we do not possess. That there seems to be a relationship between Sasquatch and UFOs, and that there is an undeniable bias within the scientific community against acknowledging that Sasquatch exists as a creature. They would like to keep Sasquatch in the realm of legend and myth. In my opinion, my humble but accurate opinion, I would say that Sasquatch should not be considered a cryptid. I believe there's enough evidence out there, an enormous body of evidence, that far beyond any other cryptozoological creature, that Sasquatch should be considered simply an unstudied creature that is real. And now you know. Sasquatch and his good friend Elvis. 2 beings that we wonder where they live. So, fact or faked? Is Sasquatch really out there, or are they really out there? It's very amusing. I have people that come into my store and museum all the time. They go through the museum. They'll come out and they'll say, "Oh, so there's more than one." And I think, did you do elementary school biology? I mean, how can there be one of anything? That's not an endangered species. That doesn't exist. There have to be enough of any creature to have a viable genetic base to continue to live and to exist. And so, no, there's not just one. There's, in my opinion, thousands, more likely hundreds of thousands of Sasquatch across this country. So, in the United States alone, over the past 60 to 70 years, there have been well over 50,000 documented sightings of Sasquatch, recorded in every single state in the country. And in reality, I really think that number is probably twice as large as that, because in my experience, I've probably documented some 300 stories just in my store, and I have a map where when someone comes in and they talk about a sighting or having found footprints or heard a Sasquatch or had something thrown at them, they will take a pin and I'll have them plot it on the map. I actually had to cover my map with plexiglass because people kept coming in and picking pins off the map and sticking them in Denver. And I didn't think Sasquatch was appearing in Denver very often. So the problem was I didn't know where those pins had come from on the map. And every one of those pins is a story that is very significant to someone. And so I had to cover it to protect it, unfortunately. This is a map of just 313 sightings from 1924 to 2012. You can imagine what that map would look like if all 50 to 60,000 sightings were plotted on there. You would not even see any black space. And now here's the interesting thing about the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. And I'm not here to slam them. They've done a great job of being really the first ones to start documenting and gathering data about Sasquatch in a very significant chronological, systematic way. But one thing I do have against the BFRO is that in their database, any encounter that has any paranormal aspect to it at all, they put to the side. They will not put that in their database of accounts. For their own reasons, I don't know why that would be, but in my experience, at least a third of all Bigfoot encounters I've had have had some paranormal aspect to them. That's a lot of stories to just sweep under the rug because you don't tend to agree with what the person is telling you happened. But in my mind, that's really not respecting that person. People come in all the time and they'll say, well, my cousin or my brother, my aunt says they saw a Sasquatch, and they obviously don't believe them. So now I've started asking them, so is your brother typically a liar? And they'll say, no. I say, well, why don't you believe him in this occasion when he's talking about this experience? Well, I think he saw something, but I don't think it was a Sasquatch. But you weren't there, right? No. But your brother's not a liar? No. So really, who has the problem in this situation? Now, my town of Bailey, just to give you an example, is right here. If you can see the cursor. Our research team has recorded 31 sightings within 15 miles of Bailey in the past 20 years. And it seems like the sightings are becoming more and more frequent. Now, that could be for a number of reasons. It could be because more people are in the woods than used to be. It could be because more people have this on their mind than used to be. I know for a fact that people are going into the woods and trying to imitate tree structures, which we'll talk about in a moment, that Sasquatch builds to try and fool people. That's how widely known this has become, that people actually want to fake it so that other hikers think that they've seen a Sasquatch structure of some kind. In fact, I had 2 women come in my store, about a year ago. They had been eating at the restaurant across the street, and they said, we were sitting there and there was somebody at the table next to us claiming that, and kind of mocking you and your museum, saying that whenever you take people out into the woods to do an investigation, he goes out ahead of you, and he's the one knocking on trees, and he's the one making footprints. And so I listened to these women, and I said, well, that's interesting, because anytime I go out, I never tell anyone where I'm going, when I'm going, or who I'm going with. So how would he know that? And they said, well, we didn't believe him, but that's what he was telling the people at his table. So this kind of thing happens a lot in the Bigfoot community. So some of the physical evidence that we can find are obviously footprints. Now, short of actually seeing a Sasquatch, and I've seen one in the daytime, and I've had many encounters at night, and I'll show you a little bit later how we see them at night. But footprints are one of the clearest, especially when you get a footprint that actually shows toes, is defined. In this case, with this picture, this woman had heard some tree knocks. This is about 15 miles from Bailey. She followed the sound of the knocks, and she found two tracks. This was the right foot. She found a left foot that were so fresh that the grass was still springing back up after it had been pushed down by the foot. And but we've found quite a few tracks over the years. We get a lot of snow in the Rockies, obviously, and most of the tracks we found have been in snow. This particular track here, we were out after an early fall snow, taking a look to see if we could find tracks. We found something crossing a road, so half of us went one direction, half went the other. And we climbed up on a rock outcropping where the tracks seemed to go, and there was this track, and unfortunately the picture doesn't show it. To the right of it was another footprint. Now this track was about, I would say, 10 inches long. It wasn't a very large track, probably a juvenile, but next to it was a 3-inch barefoot track. I don't know too many people who go barefoot in the woods in the snow, let alone take their infant out there barefoot in the snow. And so those are really hard to disprove when you find evidence like this. But it's very compelling, and we find enough tracks that would lead us to believe that in that area around Bailey, say a 15-mile radius, there cannot be any fewer than 5 family groups. It's too wide of an area for one family group to be responsible for all the sightings we're having. Now, and that's just a guess, that's an educated guess. So if we have 5 family groups just around our town, multiply that out across the entire country, how many are we talking about? I mean, we're talking about numbers that would defy our imagination. So another story, another encounter that shows a different aspect to Sasquatch is we were camping in the flat tops of Colorado. Now, the flat tops is an area that has had tremendous Sasquatch activity. And I have a couple of friends who go back there repeatedly. And I hope I remember to mention this when I mentioned the UFO relationship, because recently in the past year, some very strange things have been happening in that same area that are, we think, related to extraterrestrials. Let's see. So, the first night we went out, it snowed that night. Sasquatch are very particular about when and where they leave tracks, and none of them came near the camp. The snow was too fresh. During that day, the sun came out, it melted, and it froze hard. And so that night, we were not going to get any tracks either. But during the night, about 2 in the morning, I heard something. The road coming into the campsite was clear of snow, and the campsite itself. And I was in a tent with another researcher, and it's an outfitter tent, so we could stand up inside. It's quite tall. and we were asleep. Now, this particular friend has had, I think he said 300 encounters with Sasquatch over 14 years. So we're lying there. I wake up and I hear something coming up the road, and all I can hear is crunch, and then a long pause, and then crunch, and just very quietly coming in. And it came all the way up to the tent and was walking around the tent. And I was trying to get my friend to wake up. I'm thinking, Jason. And I picked something up and threw it at him to get him to wake up. Finally, he woke up, and I said, they're outside the tent. And he goes, oh, good. He went back to sleep. That's nothing for him anymore, having a Sasquatch walking around the tent. So that day, it warmed up quite a bit, and that night, there was mud. So the next morning, no, I take that back. The morning that I'd heard the footsteps, about 5 in the morning, I woke up. I was lying there. It was very cold, no wind. I was lying there just listening to the birds, trying to wake up, decide if I wanted to get out of my sleeping bag. And I noticed the rain fly over the tent on my side went up like this and went back down. And I looked at it because I could see the shadow of it. I thought, did I just imagine that? And then it went up again and went back down. I thought, no, there's something out there playing with this. Then, again, they started to push on the tent. And I had a jacket hanging on the inside of the tent. And the jacket would go in like this and come back. And so I learned my lesson. I got a stick that day before so I could jab Jason and wake him up. And so I poked him and I said, Jason, look. And he said, yeah, I can see them pushing on the tent. And again, I was too afraid to push my hand against their hand. But this went on for 30 minutes from about 4:30 to 5 in the morning. And I just turned towards this and just watched what was going on. And unfortunately, about 5 o'clock, there was a truck on the other side of the tent where we had a gal was sleeping because she was too afraid to sleep in a tent. And she turned on the truck to get warm, and everything stopped, obviously. So the next day, nothing really happened. That night, as I said, it warmed up. And the next morning, we saw these tracks. Now, I don't know how well you can see this on here. But this is the heel of a track. And you can see the toes up here on this end. And then there was another impression where one just simply stood on the ground for a moment and flatten the ground out. So they do leave tracks occasionally. And then my truck was parked there, and we found these strange markings on my truck. So my guess is these were juveniles. They opened the gas cap to see what was inside the gas cap. They left strange prints. I could not replicate this print. I couldn't figure. It looks like the base of a hand, but the fingers look like they're backwards. And I don't know how that print was made. These were all made that night. And then this print, and the interesting thing about this print is there's a fifth fingerprint way out here. The hand was extremely long. And my hand, I could nowhere come close to creating the same handprint on next to this one. So they were playing around our vehicles and in the area that night. So we got ready to break camp that day, and maybe 8:30, we were having breakfast. There was no one else around. We had seen 2 other people that weekend, and they had hiked through our camp and gone on somewhere else. So we're having breakfast, and then all of a sudden we hear, just over the rise, maybe 50 yards away, 2 voices. A male and a female voice, talking, and then a scream. So you can imagine we're having breakfast, and it's like, did you hear that? And everyone heard it. And then they did it again, talking louder. Talk, scream. And, of course, no one had a recorder going because we were getting ready to break camp. So I quickly grabbed my recorder, ran across to where the sound seemed to come from, hung it in a tree, and turned it on, and we went back to breaking camp. Later, when I listened to the recording, there are some very unusual sounds. Now, what you're going to hear, and I looped each sound 3 times. First is a bizarre kind of laugh that they did. We didn't hear any of this. The recorder picked it up. The second is a child's voice. We had no children in our group whatsoever. And the third is the voice of a man, sounds like a man yelling what sounds to us like the name Luther, but it came from no one in our campsite. So let me just play this, and again, it's going to loop. So a child's voice or a young female voice, and then a voice yelling something like Luther, which I don't think it was saying Luther, but it just sounded like that. And Sasquatch, they don't just scream and grunt and roar, they talk like we do. And these were cases where that little female voice sounds like somebody saying, anybody? Anybody? And I'm sure, again, she wasn't saying that. That's just what it sounds like to us. So Jason went back to the same site a week later, pulled in, got out of his car, and he thought, let's just see what happens. And he whacked a tree twice. Bam, bam. No, sorry. He got out of his car and he yelled, Luther! And immediately he got 2 tree knocks in reply from somewhere back in the woods. Now, makes me wonder what that means in their language. That's the danger of just repeating things that you hear. It could be, dinner time, or it could be, I'm looking for a love slave or something. Who knows? But, we just repeat back to them whatever they're saying with no knowledge. This is why I long for the day when humans will be able to speak the Sasquatch language. Some other physical evidence are tree structures. How many of you, when you've been hiking, have found something that you thought could have been something made by a Sasquatch? Anybody? Sasquatch love to manipulate their environment, and the most prominent thing in their environment are trees. So I found these across the country. I found them by the thousands in Colorado. Things like this. Now, could a human make that? Of course they could. But when you find something like this a mile off the trail, why would a human go a mile off the trail and build something that no one is ever going to see? Anytime I find something right along a trail, I immediately assume it's humans that have made it. But the further away I get, the more likely I think that it could be a Sasquatch. These arches are very interesting. We find them everywhere, where they'll take a tree, they'll bend it, and then they'll jam the free end into the ground or under another tree to keep that arch shape. And people have theorized maybe this is a portal for them. They go under. Who knows? But I found thousands of these, and I found these as big as 15, 20 feet up. A tree that's this big around is bent down, and the force of bending it down snaps it at the top, and then it's jammed in the ground 6 inches or a foot. We simply could not do that. Humans do not have the strength to create these structures. Probably the most common thing we find are tree breaks that always look just like this, regardless of where we find them. They're broken and left hanging. They don't break them all the way off. They just break it and leave it hanging. And again, there's a lot of theories as to what this could mean. Maybe it's directional. Maybe it's territorial. But it's between them. They obviously know we don't understand what this means. It has to be something between different Sasquatch family groups or clans, and it has meaning for them. I was out hunting a year and a half ago. I came across this structure. Now, the end of this right here was about 5 feet off the ground. There was no obvious stump from where this tree came. And you'll see that you'll get a better idea here. The tree is woven between 2 trees here, 2 trees here, and then the top end was bent in front of the other trees. A tree simply cannot fall this way naturally. It cannot fall and land at an angle between multiple trees. So it was intentionally placed that way. Why, I couldn't tell you, but this weaving of trees in between other trees we found many times. Again, I wish I knew what they mean by it, what their intention is, but we found it everywhere. And that same morning, it was about 5 in the morning, I heard voices yelling in the forest. And when you're hunting, any man or woman out there hunting is trying to be as quiet as possible so as not to surprise the elk or the deer. And somebody's yelling in the woods, and I at first thought, what idiot is out there yelling? And then it would go quiet, and then they would yell again, more than one voice, and then it would go quiet, and they would yell again. And I finally came to the conclusion, it's not people. Nobody would be doing that out here. It's something else. So here's the question that all Sasquatch researchers are debating. What is Sasquatch? And people tend to fall into one of 2 camps when it comes to this question. Sasquatch, in one side, is possibly a distant relative of an extinct great ape called Gigantopithecus blacki. 10 feet, 12 feet tall, looked somewhat like a giant orangutan. And if that's true, if they are a descendant of Gigantopithecus, you would expect that they would be 100% flesh and blood, that they would have behavior similar to the great apes, gorillas, chimps, orangutans, that their level of language ability is very minimal, an IQ that would range somewhere between 25 and 40, like a chimpanzee, versus 90 to 120 for most humans. And the other camp would be Sasquatch is a hominid, or more specifically, a human hybrid. So this is where I would fall. I believe that this theory is supported by DNA evidence that's been done on Sasquatch. It would take another hour to talk about the DNA evidence. I'm happy to chat with you afterwards or tomorrow, but there was a study that was done a number of years ago that's in some ways has been discredited, but I believe it's still a valid study that seems to hold to this idea that the mitochondrial DNA, the female side, was human. The nuclear DNA, or the male side, was unknown. Did not appear in the GenBank database anywhere. Totally unknown. One would expect a high level of intelligence, complex language ability. They would be bipedal. And there would be evidence of rational thought and paranormal abilities, or the woo side. I'm a woo guy. And not because I like to think that that's the way Sasquatch is. I've experienced that in Sasquatch. This whole paranormal aspect to their being. So there is evidence that they have complex language that is in many ways similar to ours, but they go far beyond what we are capable of. So their vocal abilities include conversation. Many times I've been in the woods and I've heard voices talking. I assumed it was hikers about to come around the corner. No hikers ever appeared. I hear voices, different places. It sounds like humans talking to one another, male, female, juveniles, but there's no one there. They laugh They yell, they growl, they bark. I've been barked at by Sasquatch. They whoop, they roar. Their volume goes far beyond humans, both above and beyond and below our range that we can maintain. If anyone's ever been near a Sasquatch, when they let loose, I've not had this experience. I'm not sure I want to have it, but apparently the volume is so enormous that it reverberates in your chest cavity. And the response it creates in us is a desire to leave immediately, which is probably what the Sasquatch is after anyway. And I have a friend who's done some research on Sasquatch calls. They would do call blasting at night. On one occasion, they got a return call that he said made all the hairs on his neck stand up and made him want to get in the car and leave immediately. And it bounced off their chest. And that call, they have scientific proof that that call included the element of infrasound. So, should anyone wonder whether Sasquatch can use infrasound, they do. As do tigers, as do elephants, as do dolphins. And when anyone has been zapped, the terms we use, zapped or sizzled by a Sasquatch, where suddenly in the woods you feel disoriented, confused, nauseous, don't know where you are, and that may last a few minutes to a few hours, and then it kind of goes away. And we believe that that is done by Sasquatch, probably using infrasound against us. Now, I've got 3 recordings here. The first one is what we call, well, that's not the one I want, actually. I'm going to do this one. This was recorded in Colorado. We call it the Colorado Howl, and they may need to turn it up in the back a little bit, but this is typical of what Sasquatch will do typically at night. It's a very mournful, almost grieving wail, and I'll let you hear it, see what you think. Well, come on. All right. This echoed tremendously through the mountains. But you see what I mean? It sounds almost mournful, like the Sasquatch is grieving or something. It's one Sasquatch alone calling. Whoops, sorry about this. So the second, here's my guys here. The second sound was recorded on some friend's property about 2 hours from Bailey. And they've had tremendous activity on the property, and I've been there to do overnight investigations. You'll hear two sounds. One is very near and close. The other are coyotes in the distance. And coyotes, Sasquatch seems to enjoy getting coyotes riled up. And you'll often hear coyotes in conjunction with the Sasquatch call. But this was very near the house. And at the end of this, you'll hear the owner of the home, how they feel about this. See if I can get this to work. No, come on. Not cooperating. I really want you to hear this. Well. Technology. So we'll go to the third. These were recorded in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the 70s. So we call it samurai chatter. Has anyone ever heard those recordings made by Ron Moorhead? Ron's a good friend. He had a hunting camp in the 70s with about 5 other men. It was an 8-hour horse ride into the Sierra Nevada mountains. No one knew of the location except these 6 men. And they would go to this camp, and they had built a lean-to to stay in. And almost the first time they went, these creatures would come into the camp at night and do these kinds of vocalizations. In the early year or two, they were very aggressive vocalizations, trying to get these guys to leave. And there seemed to be an old man and an adult female and at least one younger female. They could distinguish between the voices. But as the years went on and the men kept going back to the same location, the Sasquatch started to try to communicate with these men, and they would say something, and they would wait for the men to reply. Then they would say it again, and they would wait. And Ron would just simply imitate back what he heard them saying. Again, I don't recommend that as a way to learn Sasquatch, because you don't know what you're saying back to them. And often when Ron would repeat it back, they would go off on this long hysterical tirade, saying who knows what, laughing. You could hear the laughter in that one recording. Let's see if I can get this to play. I don't want that one. No, I apologize, but it's a very aggressive, loud bark yell that they hear regularly. I was there 2 weeks ago. Went in on horseback to a certain area, and as we're going in the afternoon, it was full daylight, we heard the same sound, and John, one of the residents in this home, said, "Oh, there's the monster." He says they always sound just like that during the daytime. It was amazing. So I believe that they consistently demonstrate their capacity for a high-level, rational thought, which is why I think it's very probable that they share our DNA, or we share theirs. They demonstrate a sense of humor. My friend Jason went camping. He was the first one to arrive. He set up his tent, put his camp chair out, went about 30 minutes away to look for wood, firewood. He came back, and there was a boulder sitting in his chair. Not thrown at the chair, but just placed in the chair. And I can imagine the Sasquatch going back in the trees and watching Jason to see his reaction and just laughing at him. It's obviously they were playing with him to see what he would do. One of my research partners, John, in one of our former research areas, there were 2 tree breaks like I showed you right next to the path. And we always noticed these trees. We always stopped to show them to people, took pictures of them. John was by himself that day. He went in, he looked at the 2 trees, he went on in for about 30 minutes. On his way out, he saw a tree right across the path, perpendicular, about 100 yards from where the tree trunks were. And he thought, that looks familiar. And he picked it up, and he took it down, and sure enough, it was the top of one of those 2 trees had been ripped off and then placed right where they knew he would see it when he came back out. So during the day, they went and pulled that off to show John that they knew he was there and to see what his reaction would be. They also took a gigantic dump in the middle of the trail right before he got back to the parking lot. There were no dogs anywhere around, and he said it was the most enormous pile of crap that he'd ever seen. Very fresh, and he thought, thanks, that's what you think of us. And we have a display in the museum. I found a 48-inch piece of scat all in one line. I call it the tremendous turd. And it's in a display case in our museum. I cannot imagine anything that can create a 4-foot scat other than a Sasquatch. They love to throw pine cones at us, green pine cones. Again, John, my research partner, was in the woods one day and walking along the trail, and he heard a pine cone fall. Now, squirrels will bite the pine cones and cause them to drop. So he assumed it was a squirrel. So he looked up to see where the squirrel was, and over his head, from somewhere back in the woods on the other side of the trail, came another pine cone, hit the same tree, and dropped. So he looked back. He didn't see anything. He looked back up. Another pine cone over his head. 4 pine cones hit the same tree, which was at least 3 trees back off the trail. How do you throw something through the woods without hitting anything else and hit the same tree that you want 4 times in a row? John loves to sing as well, and he had this song that he would sing, I love the mountains, I love the rolling hills, na, na, na. And he was walking along singing, and he hears this thump, thump, thump in time with his song. And he stopped singing, and he thought, did I hear that? And he started singing again, and thump, thump. Something was singing or thumping along with John. We've had gifting areas with them for a number of years, and the idea with gifting is pick a spot that no one else knows about, off the trail, take some items out there that might be of interest to a Sasquatch, and see how they interact with us. And we over 2 years, 3 years, we had them take over 100 items that we placed out there. They would rearrange what we put. They would bring us gifts in return. On one occasion, let's see, I think I have a... On one occasion, we put these rocks in the top picture. We just scattered some rocks, came back, and they were formed into almost like a brooch or necklace form below. We put little toys out to see what they would do with them. If we put toy horses out, they would take them. If we put little dogs, they would throw them on the ground. And this cow, I don't know if you can tell, but sticking in the articulation of its neck is a blue jay feather sticking straight up that we did not put there. So they came and stuck that in there kind of to say, all right, we see you guys. This is to let you know we're here. We tried one time to get their fingerprints. We thought we would fool them. We had a jar that we sterilized. They seemed to love the ends of deer antlers, so we would cut off deer antlers, the deer tines. We filled the jar about halfway full with deer tines, used gloves, turned the jar over on a rock without the lid, put big rocks around it and a big rock on top. And we thought there's no way they're going to get those out of there without leaving prints on that jar. We came back a couple days later. We thought, well, they haven't been here. Everything was exactly the way we'd put it, but the jar was empty. And we pulled everything off, and not a print. I gave it to a police detective friend. He said, there's nothing on that jar. How did they do that? I have no clue. So let's switch in a few minutes here that we have left to talk about the weird side. What goes beyond the normal and physical side of Sasquatch. They seem to have this ability to appear and disappear seemingly at will. I have 2 friends that have watched them while they are looking at the Sasquatch, watched them dematerialize and disappear in front of their eyes. The Sasquatch that I saw was up on a rock high above me on the edge of a lake. I was fishing, I looked up, I saw the Sasquatch standing at the edge of the rock looking down. Of course, right then a fish grabbed my fly, so the line jerked. I looked at the fly and I looked back up and it was gone. Faster than it could have moved away physically, it simply disappeared. And this has happened repeatedly. I've heard reports of this. The ability to cloak themselves and remain hidden, if that's what's cloaking itself. Now, something was cloaked. We know that. We couldn't say if it was a Sasquatch or if it was something else. Excuse me. I've seen color and movement in the trees. I thought there were hikers moving through the trees and I would see them come out. There was no one there, but I absolutely saw color and movement, but I could see through it. Nothing ever came out. I have another friend who was in the woods and she saw next to a tree this shimmer. I call it the Predator effect. If you've ever watched the movie Predator, the same idea. There's a shimmer in the air. You can see through it, but it's a definite shimmer. And while she was watching, the shimmer shape moved and stayed in the same shape. At that point, she decided she didn't really want to know what it was and left. Eye glow. Now, we're going to look at this in a moment. Sasquatch, 100%, has the ability to shine light out of their eyes. This is not reflected. This is emanated from their eyes. It's extremely bright. If you are in the woods, you're camping, and you see lights in the woods, you might assume they're flashlights. In many cases, they may not be. They may be Sasquatch eyes. And with the naked eye, you can only see one light, but when you put binoculars up to it, it separates into two. And which would explain how they can move through the woods so easily at night. They can light their own way with their eyes. And you can see this from hundreds of yards away. The ability to heal diseases, even terminal illnesses. Native Americans tell us they're surprised that we don't know about this. They're like, of course they heal. They have shaman abilities. Well, I have firsthand knowledge of a situation where a woman was dying of cirrhosis of the liver. She went camping with a bunch of other women. Long story, but that night, the first night they were there, she went to urinate before she went to bed next to two trees. When she stood up, there was only one tree. She went to bed. During the night, she heard something come up from a distance away, walk up to the tent, and started tapping above her head on the outside of the tent. It went around to every woman in the tent, tapping over them. It could obviously knew where the women were, even though it was outside and they were inside. Came back to her, tapped for a long while until she said, "You're frightening me, please go away." And it did. In the morning, she was completely healed of cirrhosis. Her stomach was flat, it was palpable. She went to the doctor a month later. The doctor said, "You have no cirrhosis, your liver function is normal, your blood count is normal. If you tell me a Sasquatch healed you, then I believe you because I have no explanation for what happened to you." And the ability to communicate telepathically with humans, often called mind speaking. We've talked about this as being an extraterrestrial ability, an ET ability. Maybe this is one reason why we think Sasquatch has something to do with ETs, that they have the same abilities. So I have two videos I want to show you of eye shine. Now, I'm just going to play this one and let you watch. 10 p.m., pitch black, no moon. So every light you're going to see here, this was taken through a night vision goggles is a pair of eyes. We counted 15 to 17 sets of eyes. But it looks like a flashlight in the woods. It's so bright. I've now seen this 4 different times, and I've learned what to look for. When we got to this location and saw the lights, there was one light that was moving very quickly towards us, and then it stopped halfway between us and the other lights and just stayed there. And I believe it was just a sentinel to watch that we didn't go any closer to them and they didn't come any closer to us. The rest of them just stayed, but they were different heights, different widths to the eyes. But you can see how bright this is. And this one, I'm going to go ahead and play this one for time's sake. I recorded this 2 weeks ago, 1 a.m. The reason it's so shaky is that it was very cold, and I was holding a night vision binoculars and trying to record without any kind of a tripod. But this was bizarre. So these are eyes, maybe 100 yards away, maybe less. But as it turns its head, there's a black dot in the middle of its left eye, and I cannot figure out what that is. The right eye doesn't seem to do that, but the left eye, there it is again. It's very bizarre. But it's obviously turning its head back and forth. One eye would be brighter than the other. And this was up at least 10 feet up, maybe higher. So they were either in the tree or they were that tall. But their eyes glow from within. Cannot explain it. So before we end here, just quickly, is there a relationship between Sasquatch and UFOs? I was involved in a project, documentary called The Bigfoot Alien Connection Revealed, where we talked about this and tried to understand what that connection might be. But there's a growing body of evidence that Sasquatch and ET share appearances in the same space at the same time, as well as orbs and portals around Sasquatch sightings. And this can be inferred just by proximity. If there's a UFO sighting and a Sasquatch sighting within the same area of, say, a half a mile, one would wonder if they were associated together. In some cases, people have reported actually seeing a Sasquatch inside of a ship when they were taken in the ship, or and I heard one story where they said there was a Sasquatch reading a paper, and there's people that have said they've seen a ship land and a Sasquatch disembark from that ship. And we have numerous accounts of strange floating and flashing orbs that accompany Sasquatch, or orbs that just float through the camp silently when there's a Sasquatch around. Again, what is the relationship? I can't tell you, but this seems to happen more and more. My question is, what do government agencies, particularly the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service, know about Sasquatch? They would be the ones that would have the most interest in this topic. Either they have no knowledge of Sasquatch roaming on their land, or it's the best kept secret of the century. Sasquatch is almost certainly responsible for a percentage of unsolved disappearances or deaths in the national parks and national forests. Again, can we assume that no agency has any knowledge of this? Seems highly unlikely. I believe a time is coming sooner than later when some revelation, something's going to force the hand of these agencies that they're going to have to admit what they have known for a very long time, that Sasquatch is there and active. Couple of pieces of evidence, and then I believe I'm done. The Washington Environmental Atlas in 1975 was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, talked about climate, agriculture, and wildlife in Washington. And lo and behold, in the 1975 edition, what did we find but Sasquatch? In an official Washington state production. Even shows where they were located and spotted in Washington. Of course, the next year, that was removed from the atlas. And here's an even more compelling piece of evidence. A friend of mine has a daughter who worked in the office of the Mount Hood National Forest, a million-acre forest, and she found a questionnaire on the desk. Please don't take a picture of this if you're out there. This is their wildland fire team Bigfoot sighting report. She took a picture, turned the page, took another picture. You can't read this, but I'll tell you what it says. The first line says, "Don't bother submitting joke reports. They won't be entered in the database." So they have a database. Another line, "What was seen, heard, or found?" Question mark. "Please tell your whole story here. If you had a visual incident, take extra time to be as descriptive as you can be about the appearances and behavior observed. What was the environment like? Please describe the environment where the incident occurred, pine forest, swamp, etc. Be sure to note any nearby landmarks or structures. Were there other witnesses?" These were just 2 pages in a multi-page document for their rangers and wildland firefighters to fill out when they had a Bigfoot encounter. And you're going to tell me that if one National Forest office is tracking them, they're the only ones doing this? They can't be. There have to be other National Forest offices doing the same, and yet no one knows about this. This is a big secret. So in conclusion, given the huge amount of information on Sasquatch that's available for the armchair researcher, and even more for those willing and able to spend extended periods of time in nature, one does wonder why the scientific community continues to push back and refuse to acknowledge the existence of these amazing beings. I believe fear is the root of the problem. Fear of what we do not understand, fear of what we cannot control, fear that acknowledging the reality of the Sasquatch people living all around us may somehow open Pandora's box within our belief systems, whether religious or otherwise. I have no doubt that probably sooner than later an event or series of events will force the powers that be to come forward and come clean on what they have known is out there for possibly generations. What that event might be is your guess is as good as mine. Now I have one more slide. I was at breakfast with someone who shall remain unnamed, but his initials are Paul Hynek. And I told Paul about this last night. A researcher friend of mine who lives in Missouri, has a farm with a family of Sasquatch on it, sent me these photos. Now, on the right is a swing set. Something sat in the swing a month ago and busted the 4x4 post clean in half. Here, he replaced it, and last week they did it again. Snapped the post right in half, just the weight of sitting down in the swing. And then he found this. Any idea what this is? What you're looking at? It's a Bigfoot butt print. That's what we believe. Now, if you look at this, on the back side of the butt, there's marks that look to be hair that would be hanging down on the back of the butt. And then there's a mark of something here, which we shall not talk about what that might be. And my friend said it was 17 and a half inches wide. And they had broken multiple chairs in the past, just sitting down on the chair and smashing. I don't know why Bigfoot likes his chairs so much, but I said, you're going to have to get the Bigfoot version of your chair so they don't smash. But he took a number of swabs from around this spot, and we're trying to find a good reliable DNA lab to send those to, but Sasquatch apparently likes to have a seat on the porch when my friend is not around and take a look at the farm. That is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for letting me come and be a part of this conference. And again, I'll be around if anyone has any questions for me.